She gave him love when no one else did. In return, he gave her something beyond her wildest dreams. The golden morning light filtered through the delicate curtains of a humble ranch-style home on the quiet outskirts of Nashville, Tennessee. Inside, 82-year-old Mabel Carter sat at her worn kitchen table, her frail hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. Her house was far from grand, just a simple, well-loved place she had called home for over half a century. The walls, once vibrant, had faded with time, and the floorboards whispered under every step, each creak a testament to the years she had spent within these walls. Mabel had always been a giver. For decades, she devoted herself to raising children that were never her own. As a nanny, she worked tirelessly from dawn till dusk, ironing tiny school uniforms, preparing meals, and packing lunches before the world even woke up. By night, she was still on her feet, wiping away tears, whispering bedtime stories, and tucking little ones in with gentle hands. Most of the families she worked for hardly noticed her, too caught up in their own lives to see the woman who silently held theirs together. But every now and then, there was a child who saw her for more than just a caretaker. And one of them never forgot. Now, her days were quiet, perhaps too quiet. The children she had once cradled in her arms had grown up, moved away, and faded from her life like pages turning in a book she was no longer a part of. These days, Mabel Carter spent her time in her tiny Tennessee home, flipping through old photo albums and tending to the small vegetable garden behind her house. Her life was quiet, predictable. She never complained, but there was an undeniable emptiness in the silence. Among all the children she had cared for, one had always stood out, a boy with a shy smile and eyes that carried a loneliness far beyond his years. His name was Jacob. Unlike the others, he had clung to her warmth, desperate for the kind of love that his own parents never seemed to have time for. She had patched up his torn jeans, combed through his unruly curls, and sat front row at every school event where no one else showed up for him. Decades had passed since she last saw Jacob, but not a day went by that she didn't think of him. She still whispered prayers for him, hoping that somewhere out there, he had found happiness. This morning felt like any other coffee, a little gardening, maybe a trip to the grocery store. But deep down, there was something different, a quiet sense of anticipation she couldn't quite explain. What Mabel didn't know was that today, her life was about to change in ways she never imagined. Thousands of miles away, Jacob Reed gazed out the window of his private jet as it began its descent into Nashville. To the world, he was a legend, a self-made billionaire whose tech empire had reshaped industries. Magazines wrote about his meteoric rise. Interviews framed him as the embodiment of the American dream. But behind the headlines and the perfectly crafted public image was a man who had never forgotten where he came from. His story had been told countless times, the poor kid who defied the odds and built an empire. Yet, in every version, the most important person in his journey had been left out. The woman who had saved him, the woman who had loved him when no one else would. Because growing up, Jacob's home was never really a home at all. His parents, wrapped up in their high-powered careers and endless social circles, were rarely around. Mabel Carter, the family's quiet but steady nanny, had become the one constant in Jacob Reed's childhood. She didn't just watch over him, she raised him, guided him, and gave him the kind of unwavering love that no paycheck could ever buy. Jacob remembered the little things, how she'd sneak an extra pancake onto his plate when he had a tough morning, the way her fingers worked skillfully to mend his favorite hoodie when it was falling apart, and the bedtime stories she spun, each one laced with lessons about kindness, perseverance, and the strength of a good heart. Mabel had been more than a caretaker. She was his safe harbor, his anchor in a world that often felt indifferent. Her quiet wisdom had followed him into adulthood, shaping the choices he made and the man he had become. But as Jacob's career skyrocketed, life pulled him further and further from the people and places that had once defined him. He had thought about calling Mabel so many times over the years, but there was always another meeting, another business deal, another excuse. Until last month, when he stumbled upon an old box of keepsakes, while packing up his penthouse. Inside was a single photograph, a boy no older than 8, sitting on the front steps of his childhood home. Mabel was beside him, her arm wrapped around his small shoulders, her smile as warm and familiar as the morning sun. And Jacob, he looked happy, not the kind of polished, camera-ready happiness that came with success, but something real, something deep. The memory hit him like a punch to the chest. How had he let so much time pass without reaching out? How had he never told her what she meant to him? Jacob knew what he had to do. A phone call or a letter wouldn't be enough. Mabel deserved more, something real, something that would show her just how much she had mattered. As the wheels of his jet touched down in Nashville, anticipation coiled tight in his chest. He didn't know what to expect. Did she still live in the same house? Would she even remember him? Or worse, would she be disappointed in him for staying away so long? Across town, Mabel sat in her kitchen, lost in thought, when the sound of gravel crunching under tires pulled her back to the present. She glanced out the window, expecting to see the mailman or maybe the neighbor's grandson dropping off groceries. Instead, a sleek black car rolled to a stop in front of her house, its tinted windows gleaming under the midday sun. Mabel wiped her hands on her apron, curiosity tugging at her as she slowly made her way to the door. Before she could reach the door, a tall man stepped out of the sleek black car, a bouquet of white lilac cradled in his hands. He was sharply dressed, his suit tailored to perfection, his posture confident, but there was something in his eyes, something familiar. Mabel's breath hitched, the broad shoulders, the quiet intensity in his gaze. She knew that face, and then it clicked. Jacob. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. He smiled, and just like that, she saw the little boy he used to be. "Hi, Miss Mabel." The sound of his voice sent a wave of emotion crashing over her. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't speak. She just stared, trying to reconcile the boy she had once held so close with the man standing in front of her. Jacob took a careful step forward and held out the flowers. "I've been meaning to come by for a long time," he said softly. "I'm sorry it took me so long." Mabel's hands trembled as she reached for the bouquet. The scent of fresh lilac filled the space between them. "Oh, my lord, Jacob, is it really you?" She blinked back tears. "Look at you. You've grown into such a handsome man. I can't believe it." The moment the words left her lips, he pulled her into an embrace, and just like that, the years melted away. Standing on that porch, Mabel was no longer an old woman. She was the same caretaker who had wiped his tears, packed his lunches, and whispered bedtime prayers over him when no one else did. Memories flooded her. Jacob's shy laugh, his love of puzzles, the way he'd always peek around corners looking for her when he needed comfort. "I've thought about you so much," she murmured as they stepped inside. Jacob took in the living room, his gaze sweeping over the familiar floral sofa and the old framed photos that still lined the walls. The place hadn't changed much since his childhood. He let out a breath. "This house, it feels just like I remember." They sat down at the worn wooden coffee table, the bouquet now resting beside a weathered photo album that Mabel had pulled from a nearby shelf. Jacob flipped through the pages, a smile tugging at his lips as he traced the edges of photos from long ago. "You were always there for me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "When no one else was, you were." Mabel reached across the table, resting her aged hand over his. "Oh, child. You were always special to me." She gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "I loved you like you were my own." For hours, they talked. Jacob shared stories of his journey, the struggles, the triumphs, the moments that had tested him. Through it all, Mabel listened with quiet pride, her heart swelling with every word. To the world, Jacob Reed was a billionaire, a mogul, a legend. But to Mabel Carter, he would always be that little boy who had once needed her love more than anything. But then, Jacob's tone shifted. The warmth in his voice remained, but there was something else now, something serious, something resolute. "Miss Mabel, there's something I came here to do," he said, sitting up straighter. His hand reached into the pocket of his blazer, pulling out a slim white envelope. Mabel's breath caught. Her fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair. She had no idea what was inside, but something in Jacob's expression told her that whatever it was important. "What's this, Jacob?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity and caution. Jacob exhaled a small, nervous laugh before sliding the envelope across the table. "It's something I've been planning for a long time," he said. "You gave me so much when I had nothing. This is my way of saying thank you." Her hands trembled as she picked up the envelope. The paper was smooth between her fingers, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. With careful movements, she peeled it open and pulled out a single sheet of paper. At first, the words didn't make sense. She read them once, then twice, her vision blurred with unshed tears. "Miss Mabel," Jacob said softly, his voice steady, but thick with emotion, "this is the deed to a new home. It's yours fully paid for. A place where you can live comfortably for the rest of your life." Mabel's hands flew to her mouth. "Oh, my lord," she whispered, shaking her head as tears spilled down her wrinkled cheeks. "Jacob, no, this is too much." But Jacob reached for her hands, holding them between his own. His grip was firm, reassuring. "You've always deserved more than this little house," he said, glancing around the space that had aged alongside her. "You gave everything to make sure I had a chance, even when you didn't have much yourself. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." Mabel could barely speak, her heart swelling with so many emotions that words felt impossible. "I never did any of it expecting something in return," she finally managed, her voice breaking. "I just loved you, that's all, and that's exactly why you deserve this," Jacob said. "Because love like yours, it's priceless. It's what kept me going when I wanted to give up. You taught me how to dream, how to believe in myself. This is the least I can do for you." Jacob stood then, a soft smile playing on his lips. "Come on," he said, nodding toward the door. "I want to show you something." Mabel wiped her eyes, still overwhelmed, and let Jacob guide her outside. A second car had pulled up behind Jacob's, and from it stepped a woman in a tailored suit, clearly a real estate agent, holding a large folder and a set of keys. Jacob took the keys from her hand and turned to Mabel, his eyes shining with excitement. "This is for your new home," he said, holding up the photos from the folder. "It's a beautiful place, not too far from here. It's got a big backyard with a garden, just like you love, everything you could ever need. You'll never have to worry about fixing a roof or paying another bill ever again." Mabel's legs suddenly felt weak, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Jacob caught her just in time, guiding her to sit gently on the porch steps. Her hands shook as she looked at the pictures. The house was beautiful, bigger than anything she'd ever imagined for herself. The garden, the wraparound porch, the sunlit kitchen. It was all so much more than she ever thought she would have. She turned to Jacob, her vision still blurred with tears. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. Jacob smiled, his grip still steady in hers. "Just say you let me do this for you," he said, "because I owe you everything." Tears continued to roll down Mabel's cheeks, her voice catching in her throat. She shook her head, overwhelmed, her fingers trembling as she clutched Jacob's hands. "I don't know what to say," she finally whispered. "I've never had anyone do something like this for me." Jacob squeezed her hands gently, his voice soft. "You don't have to say anything. Just know that you changed my life, and I'll never forget it." They sat there on the porch, hand in hand, lost in a moment so powerful that words felt unnecessary. Across the street, a few neighbors peeked through curtains, trying to make sense of the extraordinary scene unfolding before them. A wealthy man, once just a boy from their neighborhood, returning home to honor the woman who had once been his lifeline. For Mabel, it felt as if a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying had suddenly lifted. There was something deeply healing in this moment, not just in what Jacob had given her, but in what it meant. The love she had poured into him, the lessons she had passed down, had come back to her in the most unexpected, incredible way. As the sun dipped below the Tennessee hills that evening, the two of them sat together in Mabel's living room. The bouquet of lilac now rested in a glass vase on the coffee table, their soft fragrance filling the space. The conversation had quieted into something deeper, a peaceful reflection, the kind that only comes when hearts are full and words become almost secondary. "You know," Mabel said, her voice steady but thick with emotion, "I always told you that life isn't about what you have, it's about what you give." She let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "I never thought those words would circle back to me like this." Jacob nodded, his smile touched with something deeper than gratitude. "You didn't just say it, Miss Mabel, you lived it. You showed me what it meant to give without expecting anything in return. That's a lesson I've carried with me every day." Mabel's eyes misted over again, but this time they were tears of pride. "You've done more than I ever imagined, Jacob," she said. "Not just with this house, but with your life. You took those lessons and turned them into something so much bigger." Jacob leaned back, his eyes sweeping across the room that had once been his safe haven. The worn furniture, the old clock ticking softly on the wall, the familiar scent of home, it all brought him back. "It's funny," he mused, "when I was a kid, I thought success meant having a big house or a fancy car. But now I know it's about moments like this. It's about the people who helped you along the way and making sure they know just how much they mattered." Mabel smiled, resting a hand lightly on his arm. "You've got a good heart, Jacob. That's what matters most. And you've reminded me that even the smallest acts of kindness, they don't just disappear, they ripple out further than we can ever see." They sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of the day settle in. For the first time in a long time, Mabel felt something she hadn't realized she was missing: peace. And for Jacob, sitting in the warmth of the only real home he had ever known, he understood that no amount of success could ever compare to this feeling right here. Because in the end, love, real, unconditional love, was the greatest gift of all. Outside, the sound of crickets filled the warm Tennessee air as the streetlights flickered on, casting a soft glow along the quiet road. Jacob stood at the doorway, lingering for a moment as if trying to hold on to the feeling of home just a little longer. He turned to Mabel, his voice low but full of meaning. "You know, Miss Mabel," he said, "I don't think I'll ever stop trying to repay what you gave me. But I also know that no matter how much I give, it'll never compare to the love you showed me when I needed it most." Mabel's frail frame straightened with quiet dignity as she looked up at him, her eyes filled with something deeper than gratitude, something like understanding. "You've already repaid me, Jacob," she said softly, "more than you'll ever know." As the door closed behind him, Mabel sat back down, her fingers wrapping around the keys to her new home. But it wasn't the house itself that left her heart so full, it was the undeniable truth that love, when given freely, always finds its way back. For so many years, she had poured kindness into the world, never expecting anything in return. And yet, here it was, circling back to her in the most unexpected way. Maybe that was the greatest lesson of all, that in a world obsessed with what's temporary, it's the moments of compassion and connection that truly endure. As Mabel gazed out at the night sky, she whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, not for the house, but for the reminder that true success isn't measured in wealth or status. It's measured in the lives we touch. And somewhere down that quiet street, Jacob Reed walked away knowing that no business deal, no trophy, no amount of money would ever mean as much as this moment right here. Because in the end, kindness always finds its way home.